Hey guys, tonight we're diving into what might be the most spectacularly unhinged moment in papal history. We're talking about the Cadaver Synod of 897 AD, where Pope Stephen VI decided that being dead was absolutely no excuse for avoiding a good old-fashioned courtroom beatdown. This is the story of a man so consumed by posthumous pettiness that he literally dug up his predecessor, dressed him in papal robes, and put a 9-month-old corpse on trial. Yes, you heard that right, a corpse on trial, in front of bishops who were probably questioning every life choice that led them to that moment. So before we descend into this medieval fever dream of ecclesiastical revenge, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me unpack humanity's most creative displays of institutional madness. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing who's brave enough to join me for these journeys into historical insanity, whether you're having morning coffee in Tokyo or winding down with wine in California. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something strong, because you're going to need it, and let's settle in for tonight's tale together. This is the story of how one pope's grudge became so legendary that it makes modern political drama look like a children's tea party. So, you think your workplace politics are bad? Adorable, truly, like complaining about a paper cut while watching someone perform surgery with a rusty spoon. Picture this, it's January 97 AD, and you're standing in the freezing corridors of the Lateran Palace in Rome, watching what might be history's most spectacular display of posthumous pettiness. The air smells like incense, wet stone, and the particular brand of political desperation that only comes from men who've run out of living enemies to blame. Welcome to the Cadaver Synod, where Pope Stephen VI decided that being dead was no excuse for avoiding a good old-fashioned papal smackdown. But let's back up, because like all truly magnificent disasters, this one didn't happen overnight. It was years in the making, a slow, burning fever dream of ecclesiastical revenge that would make a soap opera writer weep with envy. Our story begins not with the infamous trial, but with the man whose corpse would star in it, Pope Formosus. Now, Formosus wasn't your typical pope. For starters, his name literally meant handsome, which in medieval times was either deeply ironic or aggressively accurate, depending on your standards. Born around 1816, he climbed the church hierarchy like a man possessed, becoming Bishop of Porto before anyone thought to ask if maybe, just maybe, giving a guy named Pretty Boy that much power might cause problems down the road. Formosus had what you might generously call strong opinions about papal politics. He believed in things like reform, proper ecclesiastical procedure, and the radical notion that maybe the papacy shouldn't be treated like a revolving door for whoever had the most armed supporters that week. These beliefs made him about as popular with the Roman nobility as a vegetarian at a butcher convention. The late 9th century wasn't exactly prime time for papal job security. Popes were dropping like flies, and not from old age or divine calling, but from the more immediate concerns of poison, daggers, and the occasional enthusiastic strangling. The papal throne changed hands so frequently that the Vatican probably had a dedicated laundry service just for the ceremonial robes. Into this charming political landscape stepped Formosus, who managed to become pope in 1891. His papacy was marked by constant conflict with the Roman aristocracy, particularly the powerful Spoleto family, who viewed the papal office as their personal plaything. Formosus had the audacity to disagree with this arrangement, which was his first mistake. His second mistake was living long enough to make his first mistake seem reasonable by comparison. You see, Formosus committed the ultimate papal sin. He invited outsiders to come fix Rome's problems. Specifically, he called upon Arnulf of Carinthia, the Holy Roman Emperor, to come south and sort out the mess that Italian politics had become. This was roughly equivalent to inviting your mother-in-law to mediate your marriage disputes. Technically helpful, practically disastrous, and guaranteed to make everyone involved hate you forever. Arnulf arrived in Rome like a Germanic wrecking ball, and for a brief, shining moment, it looked like Formosus might actually succeed in bringing some order to the chaos. The Roman nobility, faced with actual consequences for their actions, suddenly developed a deep appreciation for proper procedure and respectful discourse. This lasted approximately as long as it took Arnulf to leave Rome and head back north. at which point the nobility went back to their regularly scheduled programming of intrigue, betrayal, and creative violence. Formosus died in April 896, and here's where our story gets interesting, because death, as it turns out, was not nearly enough to end his problems. In fact, his real troubles were just getting started. The man who would orchestrate Formosus's posthumous humiliation was Pope Stephen VI, and if central casting had been looking for someone to play the role of unhinged medieval pontiff with serious daddy issues, they couldn't have done better. Stephen was the Bishop of Anagni before his elevation to the papal throne, and he had spent years watching Formosus's reformist agenda with the kind of seething resentment usually reserved for people who chew loudly in libraries. Stephen's rise to power was sponsored by the Spoleto family, specifically Guy Ivy of Spoleto and his mother Egiltrude, who had about as much love for Formosus's memory as a cat has for bath time. They whispered sweet nothings in Stephen's ear about justice, legitimacy, and the pressing need to settle old scores, even if those scores involved digging up a corpse to have a proper argument with it. Now, you might think that becoming pope would satisfy Stephen's need for validation and power. You would be wrong. Stephen had the kind of grudge that couldn't be satisfied by merely undoing Formosus's policies or excommunicating his supporters. No, Stephen needed something bigger, something that would echo through history as the ultimate expression of, "I told you so." He needed theatre. The idea of putting a dead pope on trial wasn't entirely without precedent, but it was rare enough that most people assumed it was the kind of thing that only happened in nightmares or particularly creative works of fiction. Stephen, however, was a man of vision, and his vision involved dragging Formosus's 9-month-old corpse out of its tomb and putting it on trial for crimes against the church. The logistics alone should have given anyone pause. Medieval preservation techniques were, shall we say, rudimentary, and January in Rome wasn't exactly optimal conditions for maintaining the dignity of a corpse. But Stephen was undeterred by minor concerns like decomposition, public health, or basic human decency. He had a point to make, and by God, he was going to make it, even if it required props that belonged in a horror story. The preparations for the synod began in earnest. Stephen assembled a court of bishops and church officials, most of whom were probably wondering if this was really what they had signed up for when they took their vows. The Lateran Palace was prepared for what would surely be the most unusual legal proceeding in papal history, complete with specially constructed seating arrangements that would accommodate both the living participants and one very deceased defendant. Meanwhile, across Rome, word of the upcoming trial spread like wildfire through the streets, taverns, and brothels. The common people, who had seen their share of papal weirdness over the years, were nonetheless impressed by this new level of creative vindictiveness. Betting pools were established on various aspects of the proceedings. Would the corpse be dressed in papal robes? How many pieces would it be in by the end? Would Stephen actually try to get it to respond to questions? The clergy, for their part, were experiencing what modern psychiatrists might recognize as collective cognitive dissonance. On one hand, they were men of God, committed to dignity, respect, and the proper order of things. On the other hand, their boss was about to have a very public argument with a dead man, and their careers depended on looking enthusiastic about it. As the date approached, the atmosphere in Rome became increasingly surreal. Street vendors began selling what they claimed were relics from Formosus's papacy. Artists sketched speculative drawings of what the trial might look like. Priests gave sermons that somehow managed to justify the upcoming proceedings without actually explaining what was about to happen. Because honestly, how do you explain something like this to a congregation without sounding completely insane? The night before the trial, Stephen reportedly spent hours in prayer, though what exactly he was praying for remained a mystery. Guidance, divine approval, the strength to maintain his composure while cross-examining a corpse. The historical record is frustratingly vague on this point, but one imagines that whatever Stephen was discussing with the Almighty, it was a conversation that probably raised some eyebrows in heaven. January arrived with the kind of bone-chilling cold that makes you question life choices, and on that fateful day in 1897, the doors of the Lateran Palace opened for what would become known as the Cadaver Synod. The assembled bishops, dressed in their finest robes and most serious expressions, filed into the chamber like extras in a medieval nightmare. Then came the star of the show. Formosus's corpse, dressed in full papal regalia, was propped up in a chair like the world's most expensive and disturbing puppet. 9 months in the ground hadn't been kind to the former pontiff, and the sight of his decomposed remains wearing the ceremonial vestments of office created a visual that would haunt the participants for the rest of their lives. The smell alone was enough to make several bishops excuse themselves, claiming sudden urgent business elsewhere in the palace. But Stephen, magnificent in his madness, took his place as chief prosecutor and began the proceedings with all the ceremony and gravity of a legitimate trial. He addressed the corpse directly, his voice echoing through the chamber as he outlined the charges against the former pope. The assembled clergy watched in fascination and horror as Stephen gestured theatrically, pointed accusingly, and waited for responses that would never come. The charges against Formosus were as creative as they were vindictive. Stephen accused him of perjury, of coveting the papal office while still serving as Bishop of Porto, and of violating canon law by moving from one bishopric to another. These were technical violations at best, the kind of ecclesiastical paperwork errors that usually resulted in strongly worded letters, not posthumous show trials. But Stephen was just getting warmed up. He accused Formosus of crowning Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor without proper authority, of disturbing the peace of the Church, and of generally being a disruptive influence on papal politics. The irony of making these accusations while conducting a trial featuring a prominently displayed corpse was apparently lost on Stephen, who continued his prosecution with the fervour of a man who had found his true calling. The most surreal aspect of the entire proceedings was Stephen's insistence on treating it as a real trial, complete with opportunities for the defendant to respond to the charges. When Formosus, predictably, failed to offer a defence, Stephen appointed a deacon to speak on his behalf. This poor individual, whose name history has mercifully forgotten, was tasked with defending a dead man against charges that were largely political in nature, while said dead man sat decomposing in full papal regalia just a few feet away. The deacon's defense strategy was understandably limited. How do you defend someone who can't speak, can't present evidence, and is currently in various stages of decay? The appointed defender did his best, arguing that Formosus had acted within his papal authority and that his decisions, while controversial, were not technically violations of church law. But his heart wasn't really in it, and who could blame him? It's hard to mount a vigorous defense when your client is literally dead and your audience is watching a madman berate a corpse. Stephen, however, was in his element. He paced back and forth, delivering what was essentially a one-man show disguised as a trial. He recounted Formosus's alleged crimes with the passion of a wronged lover, the precision of a trained lawyer, and the theatrical flair of an actor who had finally found the role he was born to play. The assembled bishops watched in stunned silence, probably wondering how they had ended up as extras in this particular drama. Hour after hour, Stephen continued his prosecution, pausing occasionally to address the corpse directly, as if expecting it to suddenly sit up and offer a rebuttal. The smell in the chamber grew progressively worse as the day wore on, but Stephen seemed oblivious to the physical discomfort of his audience. He was a man possessed, driven by a fury that death itself couldn't diminish. The verdict, of course, was never in doubt. After what must have felt like the longest day in ecclesiastical history, Stephen pronounced Formosus guilty on all charges. The former pope was stripped of his papal vestments, his papal acts were declared null and void, and his ordinations were invalidated. It was a thorough and complete destruction of Formosus's papal legacy, accomplished through what was essentially an elaborate argument with a dead body. But Stephen wasn't finished. In a final act of vindictive theatre, he ordered that 3 fingers be cut from Formosus's right hand, the fingers that had been used to give papal blessings. The corpse was then dressed in the simple garments of a layman and dragged through the streets of Rome like a grotesque parade float, while citizens gathered to witness this unprecedented display of posthumous humiliation. The procession through Rome was a sight that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. Here was a former pope, or what remained of one, being dragged through the streets like a common criminal, while the current pope followed behind, presumably satisfied that justice had finally been served. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered, some jeered, some crossed themselves, and more than a few probably went home and seriously reconsidered their career choices. The corpse's final destination was the Tiber River, where it was unceremoniously dumped like refuse. Formosus, who had once wielded the power of the papal office, ended his earthly journey floating down a muddy river, while fish and river rats investigated this unexpected addition to their environment. It was an ignominious end to what had already been a thoroughly undignified day. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn, because apparently the universe has a sense of humour about these things. Shortly after Formosus's corpse was dumped in the Tiber, a monk fished it out and gave it a proper burial. This act of basic human decency would prove to be more significant than anyone realised at the time, because the Cadaver Synod, rather than settling the matter of Formosus's legacy, had only opened a new chapter in the ongoing drama. The immediate aftermath of the trial was relatively quiet. Stephen, having achieved his goal of publicly humiliating his deceased predecessor, settled into what he probably assumed would be a peaceful papacy. The Roman nobility, who had sponsored this bizarre spectacle, seemed satisfied that their point had been made. The clergy tried to pretend that the previous day's events had been perfectly normal, while secretly wondering if they needed to update their seminary training to include courses on dealing with insane superiors and advanced corpse management. But Rome, as it turns out, was not quite ready to accept the new normal that Stephen had attempted to establish. The Cadaver Synod, rather than demonstrating Stephen's authority and settling old scores, had created something entirely different, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things had gone too far. The first signs of trouble came from an unexpected source: popular opinion. The common people of Rome had initially been entertained by the spectacle of the trial, but as the immediate shock wore off, a different sentiment began to emerge. There was something deeply disturbing about the idea that death provided no protection from political persecution, that even the grave couldn't shield you from your enemy's wrath. If they could do this to a pope, what might they do to ordinary citizens? Rumours began to circulate through the city's taverns and markets. Some said that Formosus's spirit was restless, that his unjust treatment had created a vengeful ghost that walked the halls of the Lateran Palace. Others claimed that God himself was displeased with the proceedings, pointing to various natural disasters and unfortunate events as signs of divine wrath. Whether or not anyone actually believed these stories, they served a useful purpose. They gave people a way to express their unease about what had happened without directly challenging Stephen's authority. Meanwhile, within the church hierarchy, the Cadaver Synod had created fractures that Stephen either couldn't see or chose to ignore. Many bishops and clergymen who had participated in the trial began to have second thoughts about what they had witnessed. The more they reflected on the proceedings, the more uncomfortable they became with their role in what was increasingly being seen as a grotesque farce rather than a legitimate exercise of papal authority. These doubts were compounded by practical concerns about the implications of the trial. If Formosus's papal acts were truly null and void, as Stephen had declared, then all of the priests he had ordained were no longer legitimately ordained. This created a cascade of canonical problems that threatened to undermine the entire structure of the church. Suddenly, bishops who had been ordained by Formosus, ordained priests, found their own authority in question. The logical endpoint of Stephen's vindictive justice was ecclesiastical chaos on a scale that made the original problems with Formosus seem minor by comparison. The political situation was equally unstable. The Spoleto family, who had sponsored Stephen's rise to power, began to realize that they had created a monster they couldn't control. Stephen's obsession with Formosus had consumed so much of his energy and attention that he was neglecting the day-to-day business of papal governance. The alliance that had brought him to power was beginning to fray, and his former supporters started to wonder if they had made a serious miscalculation. International reaction to the Cadaver Synod was swift and overwhelmingly negative. News of the trial spread throughout Christian Europe, where it was met with shock. disgust, and serious questions about the stability of the papal office. Bishops and clergy from across the continent sent letters expressing their concern about the precedent that had been set. If popes could be put on trial after their deaths, what did that mean for the dignity and authority of the papal office? More immediately threatening to Stephen was the reaction of Arnulf of Carinthia, the Holy Roman Emperor whom Formosus had crowned and who had been implicitly condemned by the trial's verdict. Arnulf was not the sort of man who appreciated being told that his imperial coronation was invalid, particularly when the message was delivered via posthumous puppet show. He began making noises about the need to restore proper order to Rome, which in medieval diplomatic language was roughly equivalent to saying, "I'm bringing my army south, and someone is going to pay for this nonsense." As spring turned to summer, the pressure on Stephen continued to mount from multiple directions. The Roman population, initially entertained by the spectacle, was becoming increasingly restive. Church officials were quietly expressing doubts about the wisdom of the Cadaver Synod. International criticism was growing stronger, and most ominously, the political coalition that had brought Stephen to power was beginning to collapse. But Stephen, magnificent in his delusion, seemed oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around him. He continued to govern as if the Cadaver Synod had been a complete success, as if the vindication of his position had been so thorough and convincing that all reasonable people would naturally fall in line behind his leadership. He issued decrees, held audiences, and conducted the business of the papacy with the confidence of a man who believed he had just scored the greatest victory in ecclesiastical history. This disconnect between Stephen's perception of events and the reality of his situation would prove to be his downfall. A more astute politician might have recognized the warning signs and taken steps to shore up his position. A wiser man might have realized that publicly humiliating a dead predecessor had created more problems than it had solved. But Stephen was neither astute nor wise. He was a man possessed by his own narrative of righteous vindication, and he was completely unprepared for what was about to happen to him. The end, when it came, was swift and violent, as these things tended to be in medieval Rome. In August 897, just 7 months after the Cadaver Synod, Stephen VI found himself the victim of the same kind of political upheaval that had consumed so many of his predecessors. A popular uprising, supported by clergy who had grown disgusted with his behavior and nobles who had decided he was more liability than asset, swept through Rome like a cleansing fire. Stephen was deposed, stripped of his papal authority, and thrown into prison. Unlike his treatment of Formosus, however, Stephen's enemies didn't feel the need to wait for his death to exact their revenge. He was strangled in his cell, probably while reflecting on the irony that he had ended up suffering the same kind of sudden, violent end as so many other popes, despite his conviction that his vindication of papal authority would protect him from such a fate. But even Stephen's death didn't end the story, because the Cadaver Synod had created problems that would outlive all of its participants. The new pope, Romanus, faced the immediate challenge of cleaning up the mess that Stephen had left behind. The question of Formosus's legitimacy remained unresolved. The status of his ordinations was still in dispute, and the entire church hierarchy was riddled with uncertainty about who had legitimate authority and who didn't. Romanus, showing considerably more wisdom than his immediate predecessor, immediately began the process of reversing Stephen's more extreme decisions. He declared that the Cadaver Synod had been invalid, restored Formosus's body to an honourable burial, and began the complex process of sorting out the canonical problems that Stephen's vendetta had created. It was exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous work that effective leadership requires, and it was precisely the opposite of the theatrical vindictiveness that had characterized Stephen's approach to papal authority. But Romanus's papacy lasted only 4 months before he too died under suspicious circumstances, because medieval Rome was not a place where practical, effective leadership was necessarily rewarded with long life. His successor, Theodore II, continued the process of undoing Stephen's work, but he also died after only 20 days in office. The pattern was becoming clear. Anyone who tried to clean up the mess left by the Cadaver Synod was putting themselves at considerable personal risk. The fourth pope after Stephen, John IX, finally managed to achieve some stability, partly because enough time had passed for the immediate political tensions to cool, and partly because he was ruthless enough to eliminate anyone who might challenge his authority. John formally annulled the Cadaver Synod, restored all of Formosus's papal acts, and declared that anyone who participated in putting a dead body on trial was subject to excommunication. It was a thorough repudiation of Stephen's actions, and it effectively ended the immediate crisis that the Cadaver Synod had created. But the deeper damage had been done. The spectacle of a pope putting his dead predecessor on trial had exposed just how far papal authority had fallen, how thoroughly the office had been captured by petty political interests, and how little respect anyone really had for the dignity and sanctity that were supposed to characterize the Church's leadership. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a bizarre historical footnote, it was a symptom of a deeper sickness in the papal office that would take decades to heal. The long-term consequences of the Cadaver Synod extended far beyond the immediate political crisis in Rome. Throughout Christian Europe, church leaders and secular rulers began to question whether the papal office, as it was currently constituted, was capable of providing the kind of stable, dignified leadership that the Church required. The image of a pope berating a corpse became a powerful symbol of ecclesiastical dysfunction, and it would be cited for generations as an example of what happened when political passion overwhelmed religious authority. More practically, the Cadaver Synod highlighted the need for clearer rules about papal succession and the limits of papal authority. The fact that Stephen had been able to put his predecessor on trial, overturn his decisions, and invalidate his ordinations suggested that there were serious gaps in church law that needed to be addressed. Subsequent church councils would spend considerable time developing procedures designed to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. The story also became a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing religious and political authority. Stephen's vendetta against Formosus had been fundamentally political in nature, driven by the competing interests of Roman noble families rather than genuine religious concerns. But because he held papal authority, Stephen had been able to dress his political revenge in religious language and canonical procedure. The result was a corruption of both religious and political authority that served no one's interests and undermined the legitimacy of both institutions. Perhaps most significantly, the Cadaver Synod became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of justice and the limits of authority. The idea that someone could be put on trial after their death, condemned without the ability to defend themselves, and subjected to public humiliation as a form of posthumous punishment, struck many observers as fundamentally unjust. It raised questions about whether there should be limits to how far political and religious authorities could go in pursuing their enemies, even when those enemies were safely dead. These questions would resonate through the centuries that followed. Medieval chroniclers would cite the Cadaver Synod as an example of the excesses of papal power. Renaissance humanists would use it to illustrate the barbarism of the medieval period. Enlightenment philosophers would point to it as evidence of the dangers of combining religious and political authority. And modern historians would analyze it as a case study in institutional dysfunction and the psychology of power. But for all of its historical significance, the Cadaver Synod was also, at its most basic level, a very human story about grief, anger, revenge, and the lengths to which people will go to settle old scores. Stephen V wasn't a monster or a madman, despite his actions. He was a man who had been consumed by his own sense of righteous anger, who had convinced himself that his vendetta was actually a form of justice, and who had lost sight of the difference between personal vindication and institutional responsibility. The tragedy of Stephen's story is not just that he destroyed his own life and career in pursuit of revenge against a dead man, but that he caused so much collateral damage in the process. The bishops who were forced to participate in the Cadaver Synod, the clergy whose ordinations were invalidated, the faithful who were scandalized by the spectacle, the institution of the papacy itself, all of these were casualties of Stephen's inability to let go of his anger and move on with the business of governing the Church. In the end, the Cadaver Synod stands as one of history's most vivid examples of what happens when personal obsession overwhelms institutional responsibility. when the pursuit of revenge becomes more important than the common good, and when those in positions of authority forget that their power comes with obligations to something larger than their own grievances. The physical setting of the trial. The Lateran Palace in the dead of winter, the assembled bishops in their ceremonial robes, the corpse propped up in papal vestments, created a scene that was both absurd and terrifying, a perfect metaphor for an institution that had lost its way. The image of Stephen VI haranguing a decomposing corpse while claiming to represent the authority of Christ on earth captures something essential about the corruption of power and the dangers of unchecked authority. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story is how quickly it was forgotten by those in power, even as its lessons remained relevant. Within a few years of John IX's formal annulment of the Cadaver Synod, the papal office had returned to its previous patterns of political intrigue, violent succession disputes, and general dysfunction. The specific madness of putting a dead pope on trial was not repeated, but the underlying problems that had made such an event possible remained largely unaddressed. This pattern, of learning from spectacular failures just long enough to avoid repeating them exactly, while failing to address the deeper institutional problems that made them possible in the first place, would characterize the papal office for generations to come. The Cadaver Synod was prevented from recurring not because the Church had developed better procedures for managing papal succession, or because the Roman nobility had lost interest in controlling the papal office, but simply because no subsequent pope was quite crazy enough to think that putting a corpse on trial was a good idea. The story of the Cadaver Synod also illustrates the power of spectacle in politics and the dangers of turning governance into theatre. Stephen's trial of Formosus was, at its core, a performance designed to demonstrate his authority and settle old scores in the most public and humiliating way possible. But like many political spectacles, it backfired spectacularly, creating more problems than it solved and ultimately destroying the very authority it was meant to establish. The lesson here is not just about the specific dangers of posthumous trials or the particular dysfunction of 9th century papal politics, but about the broader risks that arise when political leaders become more concerned with making statements than with governing effectively. Stephen's need to vindicate himself publicly, to demonstrate his authority through dramatic gestures, and to settle old scores in the most theatrical way possible ultimately undermined everything he claimed to be defending. Modern readers, looking back at the Cadaver Synod from the perspective of more than 1,000 years, might be tempted to view it as simply a bizarre historical curiosity, a relic from a more primitive and superstitious age. But the psychological dynamics that drove Stephen's behaviour, the need for vindication, the desire for revenge, the confusion of personal grievance with institutional responsibility, are hardly unique to the medieval period. The specific circumstances that made the Cadaver Synod possible, a weak central authority, competing power centres, the mixture of religious and political authority, the absence of clear procedural safeguards, created a perfect storm for institutional dysfunction. But the human elements of the story, pride, anger, the inability to let go of past grievances, are universal aspects of political life that can manifest in any era. What makes the Cadaver Synod particularly instructive is not its uniqueness, but its clarity. The extremity of Stephen's actions stripped away all of the usual ambiguities and complexities that typically surround political conflicts, revealing the underlying dynamics in their starkest form. When someone puts a corpse on trial, it becomes very difficult to pretend that their actions are motivated by anything other than personal obsession and the abuse of power. The story also serves as a reminder of the importance of institutional constraints on individual authority. Stephen was able to conduct the Cadaver Synod not because he had some special authority to put dead popes on trial, but because there were no effective mechanisms in place to prevent him from doing so. The Church's governance structures, such as they were, had no procedures for dealing with a pope who had clearly lost touch with reality, and the result was that Stephen was free to pursue his vendetta until political forces outside the Church finally intervened. This highlights one of the central challenges of institutional design: how to create systems that are flexible enough to respond to changing circumstances. but robust enough to prevent individuals from abusing their authority for personal ends. The medieval church, despite its theoretical commitment to clear hierarchical authority, had failed to develop effective safeguards against the kinds of abuses that the Cadaver Synod represented. The aftermath of the Cadaver Synod, with its rapid succession of short-lived popes and ongoing political instability, also demonstrates the difficulty of recovering from institutional breakdowns. Even after Stephen's death and the formal annulment of the trial, the damage to papal authority lingered for years. Trust, once lost, proved difficult to restore, and the spectacle of the Cadaver Synod continued to undermine papal credibility long after the specific issues that had motivated it were resolved. This pattern, where institutional failures create long-term damage that persists even after the immediate causes are addressed, is another recurring theme in political history. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a one-time aberration. It was a symptom of deeper problems in papal governance that would continue to manifest in different forms for generations to come. The ultimate irony of Stephen's story is that his attempt to vindicate papal authority through the dramatic condemnation of his predecessor actually accomplished exactly the opposite. By turning the papal office into a vehicle for personal revenge and political theatre, Stephen demonstrated just how far the institution had fallen from its stated ideals. The image of a pope berating a corpse became a powerful symbol of institutional decay, one that would haunt the papal office for centuries. In the end, the Cadaver Synod stands as a masterclass in how not to exercise authority, a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing personal grievance with institutional power, and a vivid reminder that even the most sacred offices can be corrupted by human folly. It's a story that manages to be simultaneously absurd and tragic, historically specific and timelessly relevant, a perfect example of how the pursuit of justice can become so twisted that it ends up destroying everything it claims to protect. And perhaps that's the most fitting epitaph for Stephen VI and his notorious trial, that in his desperate attempt to prove that he was right and Formosus was wrong, he created a spectacle so bizarre and disturbing that it overshadowed whatever legitimate grievances he might have had, turning himself into a historical cautionary tale and ensuring that he would be remembered not as a defender of papal authority, but as the Pope who was crazy enough to put a dead body on trial. The Cadaver Synod thus takes its place in history not as a triumph of justice, but as one of the most spectacular examples of institutional dysfunction ever recorded, a reminder that power without wisdom is not just useless, but actively dangerous, and that the road to historical infamy is often paved with the best of intentions and the worst possible judgment. But let's not forget the human cost of this medieval madness, because behind all the political maneuvering and ecclesiastical theatre were real people whose lives were destroyed by Stephen's obsession with posthumous vindication. The bishops who participated in the trial spent the rest of their careers trying to live down their association with what everyone knew was a grotesque farce. Some of them wrote letters of apology, others retreated to monasteries, and a few simply disappeared from the historical record entirely, presumably having decided that a life of quiet obscurity was preferable to being remembered as extras in Stephen's macabre performance. The clergy whose ordinations were invalidated by the trial faced even more practical problems. Imagine spending years preparing for the priesthood, serving your community faithfully, only to be told that your ordination was null and void because it could be traced back to someone ordained by a pope who was retroactively declared illegitimate. These men found themselves in canonical limbo, neither fully priests nor laymen, their status dependent on the political winds that determined which papal decisions were currently considered valid. The common people of Rome, who had initially been entertained by the spectacle, gradually came to realize that they had witnessed something that would define their city's reputation for generations. Rome had always been a place of political intrigue and violence, but the Cadaver Synod added a new dimension to the city's infamy. Visitors would come expecting to see the remains of classical antiquity and the seat of Christian authority, but they would leave with stories about the place where they put dead popes on trial. The psychological impact on the participants was probably the most lasting consequence of all. Imagine being one of the bishops forced to sit through Stephen's interrogation of a rotting corpse, maintaining a facade of judicial solemnity while trying not to vomit from the smell or laugh at the absurdity. These men had to carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives, knowing that they had been complicit in something that violated every principle of human dignity they claimed to represent. And what of the deacon appointed to defend Formosus? History has mercifully forgotten his name, but one can only imagine the psychological toll of trying to mount a legal defense for a client who was literally decomposing in front of the court. Did he go home that night and wonder if he was living in some kind of elaborate nightmare? Did he question his faith, his career choice, his sanity? Did he ever recover from the experience of participating in what was essentially a theological farce dressed up as a legal proceeding? The ripple effects of the cadaver synod extended far beyond Rome's city limits. In monasteries across Europe, monks copying manuscripts would pause when they came to accounts of the trial, wondering how to record such an event for posterity. Should they include all the gruesome details? Should they try to find some way to make it seem less insane? Should they simply pretend it never happened and hope that future generations would never ask awkward questions? Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals the challenges that other European rulers faced in dealing with the aftermath. How do you maintain normal relations with the papal office when everyone knows that the current pope came to power by overthrowing someone who put a corpse on trial? How do you negotiate treaties or seek papal blessing for your policies when the institution itself has become a laughingstock? These were not theoretical problems, but practical challenges that shaped international relations for years after the event. The artistic legacy of the Cadaver Synod is particularly interesting to consider. Medieval artists, who typically portrayed papal authority with the utmost reverence and dignity, suddenly found themselves faced with the challenge of depicting an event that was inherently undignified and irreverent. Some chose to ignore it entirely. Others created highly stylized representations that minimized the grotesque elements, and a few brave souls attempted to capture the full horror of the scene. These artistic interpretations, scattered across manuscripts and church decorations throughout Europe, served as visual reminders of how far the papal office had fallen. The legal precedents set by the Cadaver Synod also had lasting implications for church law. Stephen's claim that he had the authority to put his predecessor on trial and invalidate his decisions raised fundamental questions about the nature of papal authority and the continuity of church governance. If popes could retroactively invalidate their predecessors' actions, what did that mean for the stability of church law? If papal authority could be questioned after death, what protection did it offer during life? These questions weren't merely academic. They had practical implications for everything from property rights to the validity of marriages performed by priests whose ordinations were called into question. Church lawyers spent decades trying to sort out the mess, creating new categories of canonical uncertainty and developing procedures for dealing with similar crises in the future. The Cadaver Synod, in other words, didn't just create a spectacular historical curiosity. It fundamentally changed how the Church understood its own authority and institutional continuity. The economic impact of the trial is another aspect that often gets overlooked in historical accounts. The papacy was not just a religious institution, but also a major economic player in medieval Europe, controlling vast amounts of property and wealth. When Stephen declared Formosus's acts invalid, he created uncertainty about the legal status of land grants, commercial privileges, and financial arrangements that had been made during the previous pope's reign. Merchants, landowners, and other economic actors suddenly found themselves unsure about the validity of their papal charters and privileges. This economic uncertainty rippled through the medieval economy, affecting not just wealthy merchants and nobles, but ordinary people whose livelihoods depended on the stability of legal and commercial arrangements. When no one knows which papal decisions are valid and which have been retroactively cancelled, it becomes very difficult to conduct business with any confidence. The result was a period of economic instability that lasted long after the immediate political crisis had been resolved. The international reaction to the Cadaver Synod also reveals something important about medieval communication networks and the speed with which information travelled across Europe. Despite the limitations of medieval transportation and communication, news of the trial spread remarkably quickly, suggesting that there were already well-established networks for sharing information about important political and religious events. The fact that bishops and rulers across Europe were able to respond so quickly to the trial indicates that medieval society was more connected and better informed than is sometimes assumed. These communication networks also meant that the damage to papal reputation was immediate and widespread. It wasn't just Romans who were shocked by Stephen's actions. Christians across Europe learned about the trial within weeks or months of its occurrence, and their reactions helped shape the international pressure that ultimately contributed to Stephen's downfall. The Cadaver Synod, in other words, was one of the first truly international media scandals, a medieval equivalent of a story going viral. The theological implications of the trial are perhaps the most profound and lasting of all its consequences. By putting Formosus on trial after his death, Stephen was implicitly making claims about the nature of death, judgment, and divine authority that went far beyond the specific political disputes that motivated his actions. If earthly authorities could sit in judgment of the dead, what did that mean for concepts of divine judgment and eternal rest? If papal authority could be retroactively invalidated, what did that suggest about the divine source of that authority? These theological questions troubled medieval thinkers for generations. The idea that the dead could be held accountable to earthly courts seemed to contradict basic Christian teachings about the finality of death and the exclusive authority of divine judgment. Yet Stephen had claimed to be acting with divine authority when he conducted the trial, creating a theological paradox that was difficult to resolve. The result was a period of theological uncertainty that paralleled the political and legal confusion created by the trial. The psychological profile of Stephen VI that emerges from historical accounts is both fascinating and disturbing. Here was a man who had achieved the highest office in Christendom, who commanded the loyalty of bishops and the obedience of millions of believers, yet who was so consumed by his hatred of a dead man that he was willing to risk everything for the satisfaction of publicly humiliating a corpse. What kind of personality structure makes such behavior possible? What combination of ambition, insecurity, and obsessive thinking leads someone to believe that putting a dead body on trial is a reasonable course of action? Modern psychologists might recognize in Stephen's behavior patterns associated with narcissistic personality disorder, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, or even elements of psychosis. But medieval observers lacked the conceptual framework to understand his behavior in psychological terms. Instead, they were left to wonder whether Stephen was possessed by demons, driven mad by the responsibilities of office, or simply evil in some fundamental way. These explanations, while crude by modern standards, reflected genuine attempts to understand how someone in such a position could behave so irrationally. The cultural impact of the Cadaver Synod extended well beyond the immediate religious and political spheres. The trial became a reference point for discussions about justice, authority, and the limits of acceptable behavior in positions of power. Medieval chroniclers would cite it as an example of what happened when rulers lost touch with reality. Political theorists would use it to illustrate the dangers of unchecked authority. Satirists and storytellers would draw on it for cautionary tales about the corruption of power. This cultural resonance ensured that the Cadaver Synod would be remembered long after the specific political circumstances that created it had been forgotten. Even people who knew nothing about 9th century papal politics could understand the basic horror of putting a dead man on trial, and this universal accessibility helped make the story a lasting part of European cultural memory. The trial became a kind of shorthand for institutional madness, a symbol of what happens when those in authority lose all sense of proportion and humanity. The gender dynamics of the story are also worth considering, even though women played no direct role in the trial itself. The medieval church was an overwhelmingly male institution, and the Cadaver Synod was very much a product of masculine competition, rivalry, and violence. The absence of women from the story is itself significant, suggesting a political culture so dominated by male authority figures that even the most extreme forms of institutional dysfunction were exclusively male affairs. This masculine character of the conflict also helps explain some of its psychological dynamics. The trial can be understood, in part, as an extreme form of competitive male display, with Stephen attempting to demonstrate his dominance over Formosus by humiliating him in the most public way possible. The fact that Formosus was already dead made the competition even more pathological, but it didn't eliminate the underlying psychological need for Stephen to prove his superiority over his rival. The environmental context of the trial adds another layer of meaning to the story. January in medieval Rome was cold, damp, and miserable, conditions that would have made the already unpleasant task of conducting a trial with a decomposing corpse even more unbearable. The physical discomfort of the participants, combined with the psychological horror of the proceedings, created an atmosphere of almost surreal suffering that perfectly matched the moral and political decay that the trial represented. The contrast between the grandeur of the Lateran Palace and the grotesque spectacle taking place within its walls would have been particularly striking to contemporary observers. Here was one of the most sacred spaces in Christendom, a place associated with dignity, authority, and divine presence, being used for what was essentially an elaborate form of necrophilia disguised as legal proceeding. The violation of sacred space paralleled the violation of human dignity that the trial represented. Looking back at the Cadaver Synod from our modern perspective, it's easy to focus on its bizarre and entertaining aspects while losing sight of its deeper significance as a moment of institutional and moral crisis. But for the people who lived through it, the trial was not just a historical curiosity, but a genuinely traumatic event that called into question fundamental assumptions about authority, justice, and human decency. The laughter that the story might provoke today should not obscure the horror that it inspired in its own time. The legacy of the Cadaver Synod ultimately lies not in the specific details of what happened in that cold Roman palace in January 897, but in what those details reveal about the human capacity for self-destruction in the pursuit of power and revenge. Stephen VI's obsession with posthumously destroying his predecessor became a perfect metaphor for the way that political hatred can consume everything it touches, destroying not just its immediate targets, but the entire institutional framework within which it operates. In the end, the Cadaver Synod stands as one of history's most vivid reminders that there are no limits to human folly when power is unchecked by wisdom, compassion, or simple common sense. It remains a cautionary tale for any age, a perfect example of how the pursuit of justice can become so corrupted that it destroys the very values it claims to defend. And perhaps most importantly, it serves as a reminder that institutions, no matter how sacred or powerful, are only as good as the people who lead them, and that the difference between civilization and barbarism can sometimes be measured by nothing more than the willingness of those in authority to treat both the living and the dead with basic human dignity.